Good morning. You're very welcome to this Euractiv debate supported by Terra. We're talking about forest restoration and tree planting today and asking the question, what will be the impact for climate change mitigation? Now, the EU has, of course, adopted some very ambitious targets, including a pledge to cut carbon emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared with 1990 levels. But globally, forests make a huge impact on our lives. They are the lungs, the life support system of the planet, covering about 30% of the Earth's land area, but they host 80% of its biodiversity. So forests and other woodland land cover about 40% of Europe, so we are one of the most forest-rich regions in the world. So there's an opportunity not to be missed. Planting billions of trees across the world is one of the cheapest ways of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and to tackle climate change. But of course, there are other benefits as well, not least managing our health and well-being through water regulation, through the provision of food, medicines, soil stabilisation, and air and water purification. So many issues here on the agenda. I know there's a lot to talk about, but we are going to focus on climate change mitigation. We have a wide panel for you, so I will go straight to that without further ado. You have great to join us there. Thank you all very much. We have, starting with Umberto Delgado Rosa, who is the Director of Natural Capital at DG ENVI, the Environment Department in the European Commission. Özlem Yıldırım is the Confederal Advisor to the General Confederation of Labour at the EESC. Jutta Jutland, MEP, is a member of the Environment Committee at the European Parliament, as is Ville Niinisto, also a member of the ITRE Committee as well in the European Parliament. Thank you very much for joining us. We have Sergi Moroz, who is a policy manager on water and biodiversity at the European Environmental Bureau. Elaine Koch is policy advisor at the Confederation of European Forest Owners. And last but not least, Sven Kallen is the founder and secretary of the Terra Foundation, one of our supporters here today. So we're going to talk to you a lot about this whole area. But first, I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to, if you like, set out your position. Tell us a bit about the work you're doing and maybe your answer to that overall arching question, what we think reforestation and tree planting might be able to do in terms of climate change mitigation here in Europe. Umberto, let me start with you. The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you for having me. Well, I would say that we definitely need more trees, not because they are the panacea or an alternative to reducing emissions, but we should not forget that we do have a wonderful technology to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, which is called photosynthesis. And some of the machines that do it self-reproduce, including trees. So we definitely need them in spite of us having a lot of forests. We know in Europe, many of our forests are not in a good shape. They are facing many threats. Just look to these forest fires of this summer to have an idea. So we do have this aim for tree planting, an extra 3 billion trees to be planted, the right tree in the right place for the right purpose. Indeed, planting a tree is not necessarily good for climate or biodiversity. It depends on where you plant it. And for instance, to plant trees over peatland, let's say, that will bring no benefit on this. Adding to this, I would say that tree planting is not also an alternative to natural regeneration, which is even the best approach. When we speak of restoration of forests, we can have passive restoration, where we leave the forest to regenerate alone. We can have active restoration, where we actively plant trees, or a mix where we just help the regeneration, also with some adequate tree planting. So in essence, I do think there's a big role for trees and forests in climate change mitigation, together with biodiversity and socioeconomic benefits.
Thank you very much. Özlem, let me come to you next, just for your opening thoughts. I know as a trade unionist, you're very interested in this idea of greener Europe.
Good morning. First of all, thank you very much for inviting EESC. As a trade unionist, to begin, I would like to share with you some general comments on social perspective of climate change mitigation. We welcome European ambition to achieve climate neutrality by 2015, but we should keep in mind that making a greener Europe creates many opportunities, but also many challenges for our workers and for our industries. And a greener Europe should also mean a more social Europe. No worker should be left behind, and it must be assured that all workers and citizens are entitled to decent wage, proper working condition and training, and adequate social protection. With a particular attention to the low-skilled workers, women, migrants, youngsters, and older workers. It's also very important to involve social partners, of course. And last but not least, a fair and sustainable transition should be guaranteed. The shift to the circular economy should not pose social justice problem for workers, in particular for micro and small enterprises. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Özlem. Let me turn now to our guest from the European Parliament. Jutta, let's hear from you first and what's going on in the ENVI committee with regard to this.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for letting me participate in this interesting and timely debate. I would like to start to say that my main experience is, of course, the negotiation with the climate law, and part of the target that we set that is very ambitious for 2030 contains also a sink, and that carbon sink, of course, forests play a very important role in that sense. I also would like to start by saying that I find it historic that the Commission is launching this Fit for 55 package with many ambitious proposals. Of course, we from the Parliament and offshore the progressive groups would like to see even more, but it is a transition that is happening, and it is big what also the Commission is launching. All that said, I believe that forest is one of the keys to preserve a healthy earth. Forest together with the sea is one of the lungs, so it's the green lung of our planet, and this lung is so important, both as mentioned in this introduction because of the photosynthesis, but it's also of course important because it will also give life to the products that can help us overcome the global heating by substitute fossil products that is used today and continue to be used also in the future if we don't change the way we do our production and consume. So I would like to have that dimension also in my introduction, that I see that the forests play both the role of being a sink, and there planting trees is one of the important tools, but it is also important to substitute many of the fossil fuel materials that we have today. And then some people might say, but that's a contradictory. I don't think so. If we look at different forest management, we can see that we have also models that is working better in the sense that they both mean that we plant trees and also use the forest that doesn't capture the CO2 emissions as much anymore, that is very long, old in the life cycle. That can be used also for materials that will continue to live for a very long time in the future, and that will also mean that the CO2 will be captured in buildings, in materials. So I really see that the forest should be used in both that sense. I would like to say that we have a huge problem in front of us also. I don't want to end up being negative, but we see now that we have 2/3 of a soccer field is at this moment disappear every second in the world. Of course, what we see in the Amazons is the greatest challenge that we have for the forest. And it's also so extremely negative for the biodiversity. So we need to change the way we also consume there and exploit the nature and also the people living in the Amazonas. That said, I think it is extremely important that we take a more sustainable forest strategy, and also that we have better mechanism to make sure that we don't continue this deforestation around the world. And of course, then we need also to have sustainable models in our own Europe. And I don't want to end up too negative, but we see at this moment that Europe is not going in the right direction. We see that we actually have less of sink today, and we don't plant enough trees, and we also had many problems with forest fires, with also insects and other things that destroyed forest that is there. So it's not very easy to say that this sink should compensate for reductions. So I would like to end by saying that I think we need to see that we cannot substitute reductions by having this carbon sink where we put our hopes in the forest. That doesn't mean that we should not have ambition for what we would like to accomplish with the forest, but it shall not be the substitute. And sometimes I'm afraid in the debate, also from the European Commission and in Brussels, that one thinks that we can do that we can substitute the reduction. And I never would like to contribute to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks, and a very stark statistic there you give us: 2/3 of a football pitch disappearing every second. I think we will come on to that when we discuss a little bit the international dimension. Let me turn now also to a member of the Environment Committee of the Parliament. Ville, tell us a bit about your perspective on this. I mean, I'm sure you're hearing many of the same things as Jutta.
Thank you, and obviously also a pleasure from my side to join you this morning to discuss forest restoration and tree planting and how we can address climate change in a sustainable fashion. It's also logical to continue after Jutta, because building on the work on climate law, we will have the climate legislation package, and including the LULUCF regulation now in the Parliament, and we will look at how we can increase sinks and also plant trees in a way which supports the climate goals. And I will be working as the rapporteur for the Parliament on the LULUCF regulation that was just decided yesterday. So this is something I will very much be working on. I would like to kind of like have a broader picture that some people, when we discuss about forest restoration and tree planting, for some it seems to be kind of like an accounting exercise only, or an engineering feat to be achieved. But it's better to have a broader biodiversity approach. It's the biodiversity loss that we are addressing here as well. Our ecosystems are not in shape, and we are losing land and forests still, and we are losing species. So that's the very essence of what keeps our planet habitable. So it's important that when we talk about climate action and increasing sinks, that we restore forests in a way where we also protect biodiversity. So one of the first things I would like to say in my opening statements is obviously that we need to address deforestation and address the loss of natural old-growth pristine forests within Europe, but also globally, as there are very important storages of sinks as well. And so we need to start from not doing more harm, and then at the same time continuing to build on that and increase sinks and increase restoration where there can be the best results also for biodiversity to be achieved with our concerted efforts. So I think what Humberto said, it's about planting the right trees in the right place, but also managing biodiversity in a sustainable fashion. Globally, we are still losing forest areas, as Jutta was saying. EU's consumption is accounted to be responsible for 10% of global forest loss. So these are numbers that are still quite high, and we need to address these. What we need to do is to make sure that when we now start to plan on restoring our forests, that we need to do both. We need to do afforestation, proforestation, and reforestation. And obviously, reforestation as a concept means that you need to reforest. That is, to plant trees in places where forest is the natural historic cover of the area, where there's biodiversity background for the area to be reforested. So this is one of the key challenges of the EU's restoration law, to direct action in the member states to places where the best gains for biodiversity and also for sinks can be achieved. So all in all, I think to start with, if we look at the global ambition level on climate change mitigation, 55% to 2030, I think it's certainly achievable for EU, but it's still not enough to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. So I would like to also say that the reforestation and increasing the sinks is not something that we do to offset or limit the needs to do emission reductions. We need to do both. And in the long term, we are looking at carbon negativity. So we need to take away carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that means that the work we do to protect biodiversity and do reforestation and tree planting should have a 100 years, 200 year cycle. We know that the effects and the gains will be also long term. So we are not just looking 10 years ahead, but we plan ahead to the sustainable future of mankind and our planet and the ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me now, Sergi, let's hear from you. The European Environmental Bureau obviously has a great deal of input and thoughts on this. So give us your opening thoughts on how much we can rely on replanting or reforestation.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's a very useful, very timely debate. So European Environmental Bureau is very interested, and thank you very much for inviting us to contribute to this very important debate. We do have a number of opportunities that are currently being discussed on the table. Willy already mentioned the legally binding targets for restoration. There is the EU forest strategy that is currently being discussed among member states, and European Parliament is also expected to express the position. So there are a number of opportunities that the European Green Deal has put on the table, and we are in code red. IPCC report has been very, very clear how we need to move to solve both climate and biodiversity crisis at the same time. A couple of weeks ago, the headlines in Financial Times was very much like what NGOs have been saying all these years, that we are heading for disaster. Our survival really depends on it. So we really need to solve those two crises at the same time together, biodiversity and climate. And the framing of the debate is already going in that direction. And I was very happy to hear the points that were made from the European Parliament, from the European Commission, how important it is to solve these two crises together in a synergetic way. And that's why looking at the Fit for 55 targets, we really need to make sure that we replant or restore forest that is good as a carbon sink and that is good for biodiversity as well, because the forest will only be a carbon sink if it is resilient, if it is biodiversity rich. In the past, we've seen cases where the two policies were looked at separately, and that's pretty much led to false solutions. For example, planting monocultures for bioenergy, which are really which are detrimental to biodiversity and are really not solving the problem. So we really need building on to really try to solve these two problems at the same time. So I think the mantra really remains: we need trees. It's the best technology we have for mitigating climate change, but those need to be the right trees in the right places under the right conditions. conditions. So tree planting is important, but for example, the green infrastructure in urban areas will be providing a lot of benefits, or the restoration, reforestation of forests in the right places that also allow biodiversity gains. I think what also would be extremely important is, and I think Willy already mentioned this, we also need to protect what we still have. We have a number of old growth, of primary forests. Their percentage is very low in Europe. We are also losing them. So it's absolutely crucial that those jewels are protected and under strict protection, so they don't have damaging activities in them. I think, so we really need to use the opportunities of the nature restoration law that is being prepared by the European Commission to really make sure that targets for forest restoration are ambitious. They're definitely coming on top of what's already required under the existing legislation, and that will bring additional benefits. So it will not only bring mitigation benefits, it will help with regulating water, for example. It will also bring benefits for people. It does create jobs. And I know that there was a point made about the green transition also needs to be social transition. That is very true, but we can, there are additional opportunities that will be created from proper restoration, and there are also, there are also mechanisms that can compensate for changes. For example, if there is a land that needs to, where forests need to be restored, so that can be compensation possible as well. But that's the only way forward, and the science is very, very clear. We only have 10 years to really shift around, so business as usual is really not an option. And as I said before, it is really about our survival. So we need all hands on board for proper restoration of forests and planting trees in the right places under the right conditions.
Thank you, Sergio. And I'm glad you made the point as well about urban planting, because of course we can rely on those green areas in our urban settings as temperature sinks, which are going to be, of course, increasingly necessary. But we will take that as read so that we move on to the forest nature for today's debate. Hélène, I'm very interested to hear what you have to say from the Confederation of European Forest Owners. I suspect you have a slightly more nuanced perspective on this. So give us your thoughts, please.
Well, first of all, good morning to all, and it's nice to be back after summer break. Also, as was mentioned, it was again a summer break when we have seen climate change happening and not in its best shape. So as mentioned, I'm going to share with you some first thoughts from a forest owner perspective, a European one, on tree planting, on restoration, and how could they work together. Tree planting, as it might not always be obvious, is going beyond forest. So beyond my own realm, I would say, because it's going to be in forests, in urban area, could be in an agroforestry system. And in all of that, I think we all agree that we need the right species in the right place, because they must be well adapted to their context. And this choice must be going away from dogma and be forward looking. Will these trees still be there in the new climatic conditions that are coming in the future? And also, when we think of tree planting, what about the seeds? What about the seedlings? The workforce that will be needed? Who will pay? And do we have the materials? And not the least, what about the long-term maintenance? Because tree planting is just the beginning of the story. If you now think about restoration, we have expected for Christmas the new nature restoration law, which is expected to focus also on forest ecosystem. And for us, the question is really to which forest? And to this answer, we very much hope that it will focus on the forests that are suffering from climate change and use hazard, would it be pest, windthrow, fire? But also, it's good to keep in mind that not all EU forests need to be restored, and that needs to be reminded. And now, if we think about restoration and tree planting going together, I would first take a step back and ask you to reflect on where do we do it, and the subsequent question, which is, who owns the land where you want to do it? And in that, we really believe that prior and informed consent of the owner is the key to the success, the key to the maintenance of this project. So it's really something that we are very, very keen, but also important to keep in mind in those projects that there is some uncertainty about the result, because a fire might come by, a climate might change enough, a new pest could arise, and you have to be well aware of it. And to conclude and go back to our broader subject about climate change mitigation, do we think that tree planting and forest restoration will be enough to mitigate climate change? From European forest owner, I would say no. But I'm happy to further exchange and develop that later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helene. And of course, it is part of an overall solution that we need to find. Sven, last but not least, I'm going to come to you because we're going to talk about the Life Terra project. I know the aim is to plant about 500 million trees over 5 years. So please do tell us a bit more about that and what sort of material difference it's making.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and good morning. Thanks so much for being here, and to all the other speakers and Euractiv, of course, for organizing. I was supposed to have the privilege of some slides to give you some images of what we're doing and to tell you that Life Terra is actually Europe's largest citizen-driven tree planting project. And we aim to facilitate tree planting in all countries of Europe and reach 500 million trees by 2025. For us, a tree is a symbol for change and climate awareness, and we also go beyond planting. For example, we're creating an online sustainability course for kids and a network of Terra leaders that help us organizing the events. Here in this slide, you see some examples of last year's plantings. We held almost 80 events in 8 countries, which was very challenging due to COVID situation, as you can imagine. One lesson learned is that people love to plant trees and really want to get involved in climate action. And we hope it brings them awareness of also looking at their own behavior and looking at lowering some of the impact that they cause. Key factor in Life Terra is tagging. Everyone with a phone can tag the tree he or she just planted. The species are preloaded for each planting event. You have to choose the right one, and the timestamp and geolocation are then registered in the app. This gives excellent information for the landowner. You can see the dashboard on the right bottom, where he or she will know what was planted where and when, and will help with future monitoring. So apart from personal dashboards that you will have as your planter, we're also creating company dashboards, because we have a lot of demand now from companies that want to get involved in climate action and make it more real and transparent and close home. In this slide, you see where basically an overview of all the trees planted so far, and you'll be able to zoom in and go to a specific plot. Also, future monitoring data on how these trees are performing will be featured in new layers of information in the same platform. Very quickly, what have we achieved in the first year? I'd say that we're pretty proud of what we did in the first very difficult year because of COVID. It was very difficult in some countries to operate, but we surpassed all our goals. And to refer back to some of the speakers on biodiversity, it's not in here, but we planted about 100 different species, mixed, obviously, adapted to each region. So we're very much going for multi-species ecosystem restoration, and I hope thereby contributing to an impulse for biodiversity. Now the challenge is to scale this 10 times the coming season and ensure quality, and living up to our motto that you've also heard a couple of times this morning, plant the right tree in the right place. So I look forward to learning from the other participants and from the questions today to help us improve. And if you have a project or a specific technology that can help us, of any ideas or money, of course, you're more than welcome to contact us. We'd love to collaborate. We already have a long list of collaborators in Europe, and we hope to expand it in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sven, for that introduction to Life Terra. Really useful to have sort of something concrete there as a background. So thank you all now for your opening comments. I would remind the audience that they can use the chat function to ask questions. I know many questions are already coming in there, but also that you can use the hashtag #EADebates to share on social media your thoughts, share the comments of our panelists, but also to ask questions and have a discussion as well. Humberto, I'm going to come back to you and ask you about, you mentioned forest fires as one of the big issues. Now, this is something that has come up in our chat function with a lot of the audience members concerned about this and wondering about what can be done in terms of managing this problem of deforestation as well as alongside the planting. I know also that Jutta mentioned the deforestation of the Amazon. This is a global problem. So what really can Europe do in mitigation?
Well, and sticking to forests, because as I said in the beginning, the discussion we are having on forests and tree planting is not an alternative to reducing emissions, but is a fundamental component in the climate and biodiversity equation, which really cannot be disentangled and must be tackled together. The first thing we can do as Europe is to preserve our forests, and especially the remaining old growth forests and primary forests that we still do have. And remember that old growth forests, they not only store the carbon they have, they keep storing it, including in the soil through their activity. So they are really assets that we should preserve, and we cannot expect other places in the world to do it if we don't do our share on that angle. Second, we will also address deforestation, not only within Europe, illegal logging and so forth, and take a look to the new EU forest strategy to see the new impulse towards dealing with forests. But we will also come with initiatives to tackle avoiding deforestation and forest degradation from our imports, which was expressed in the Green Deal, in the biodiversity strategy also, and it's one of the important aspects. So the EU should, as it has done in my view so far, lead by example on climate change, lead by example on biodiversity, and for that, surely forests and tree planting properly conducted is a fundamental element.
Thank you, Humberto. I'm going to take another question now from an audience member. Martin Behrens is asking a very, very practical question, which is really how many trees are needed to make a climate impact? Let me put that, Sergi, to you. Have you thoughts on how do we quantify this question?
It's a very good question, and I think we'll probably, one of the places to try to solve it as well is through the legally binding on nature restoration. As Helen mentioned, the forest is one of the important ecosystems, also because they're so important for biodiversity and climate, to be restored. And we've been advocating that 15% of EU's land area and sea area should be under restoration, focusing on the ecosystems that are important for biodiversity and climate, including forests. However, it would be difficult to have a top-down approach. You would need to look at the particular area and see which area used to be forest, where forest could be recreated, restored, re-established, or you can also look at the existing protected areas and restore which should come in on top of the obligations that come from the nature legislation. So this, our key message both to the European Commission that is currently holding the pen on drafting this proposal, but also to the member states and to the European Parliament, make this law as ambitious as it could be. Again, it would be difficult to say, the specific area of forest. Member states would need to work it out based on their circumstances, but at least 15% of EU's sea and land area to be restored by 2030, recognizing the urgency.
Thank you. Sven, same sort of question to you. I mean, what sort of numbers are we talking about in order to see that there is being successfully some sort of mitigation happening? How do we quantify that? How do we actually count it and measure the success in offsetting carbon emissions by tree planting?
Well, that's a very good question, Jennifer. Obviously, we're trying to do our bit. We took 500 million as sort of a big number to see if we could plant with 1 tree for each by each European by 2025 as sort of a way to change people's behavior and doing our bit for climate change mitigation. But of course, if you look at that, we might be losing 1 billion trees per year, globally speaking, then even 3 billion by 2030, which is the objective of the European Commission, is little. So I think we just have to plant more, and obviously we have to plant it in the right way. But if we keep cutting more, and if there's more damage due to forest fires, we simply will have to, prevent it on the one hand, but on the other hand, also try to restore very fast in order to start balancing somehow the situation in which we are.
Thank you. Ville and Jutta, a question to you, because of course, when it comes to drawing up policies in these areas, it's all about setting targets and so on. I mean, is there an argument for insisting on a certain level of carbon offsetting to go through reforestation or through replanting? Ville, perhaps you could go first.
Okay, yes, I think it's important that we set targets and goals for this. And obviously, if we look at the numbers, they are quite high that needs to be put into tree planting. For a forested country like Finland that already currently has an intensive forest industry, that creates both problems and possibilities for sustainable forest management and the environment and climate action. I will not go into that deeper, but Jutta said that some of the forest solutions can be substitutes to oil-based solutions, but at the same time, nature and biodiversity is currently hampered, and still we have biodiversity loss even in those countries that try to say that we certify our forest use. So there's a lot of forests that are being cut every year, and in Finland we currently already plant 150 million trees every year just to replace the trees that are being cut. So the numbers of reforestation have to be in billions and billions in order to have an effect. But I think what Sergei was saying, I think the right goal here is going into areal goals. So the restoration law should set a percentage target, 15% or even 30% of degraded lands and waters in Europe that can be restored into better biodiversity conditions. And then we should look also at the same time into, like I said earlier, to combine the biodiversity policies with climate policies in the sense that we create better ecological corridors between the areas which we restore where we plant trees, and with the old pristine forest, the old growth forest we still have left, for biodiversity and species to be better supported. So there needs to be good coordination at the European level. So that's why the EU restoration law is such a key thing here, because biodiversity needs to be protected also across the borders. So I think this is something where we also have low-hanging fruits. When I speak with the forest industry or forest owners, we have also in a country like Finland, for example, a huge potential in restoring damaged ecosystems. For example, wetlands. We have trained over 4 million hectares of wetlands for the use of forest industries mainly. And these former wetlands don't create a lot of forest growth because it has been a very unsuccessful policy. This was done in the 50s, 60s, and it was a big environmental problem. But now, by restoring these lands, the forest owners actually get compensation. So we should look also incentives to the owners to increase things and restore land, that they get also funding for it. And since it's also not productive land for forest industry, those are the low-hanging fruits. We should also look where we get the maximum result for the environment and trees, and minimum effect on the minimum need to change for the forest industry. So there are a lot of those things here, low-hanging fruits that we can achieve.
Thank you. Jutta, I'd like you to build on that in terms of targets. We have a question or a comment. Aiga Grasman is saying, how are countries with little forested areas, for example, the Netherlands and Denmark, going to fulfill the 30% and 10% requirements for land protection? She's asking, is it feasible? I mean, obviously there are different issues in different member states. So how do we work with targets to make sure that everyone has the best chance of achieving those targets?
Thank you for that important question. First of all, I think it is really important that the Commission addressed this, and they promised us to do so, because this was actually one of the questions from the European Parliament. How do we make sure that everyone takes their part of this? Of course, in a way that it's possible for that country, but it would not help the situation if there are some countries who should help other countries not to do their part. And in this case, there are some challenges, and that's why the Parliament were also making sure that at least we had this minimum of reduction in the target, because I want to be a good sport here and not talk about the other institutions in a very negative way, because we actually came together in a very fine way in the end. But there were some thoughts from the other institutions in this long travel of creating the climate law, where I think they wanted to be a bit helped by having a carbon sink instead of being very sharp when it comes to the reduction part. And the problem with the sink is, as described, that it looks very different for the 27 different member states. And there are different opportunities for the member states to help out here. The Nordic countries have a better situation, and I would say smaller countries with very little forest cannot help out in the same way. So therefore, I think it needs to be better addressed also now. And then also another problem that we saw is the unpredictable part of this. It is important to start changing the reduction of forest, the deforestation also happening in Europe, and this, the fact that this carbon sink is actually decreasing at the moment. So that's very important. But we cannot put our hopes into have that turn, that change until 2030 completely, because there are many things that's unpredictable, like forest fires, like these kind of insect attacks that not at least Germany has experience of. And I don't want us to put our future into some hopes. We need to make sure that we can also deliver. So these are some question marks, and I would say we need to compensate for the question marks by also being even sharper when it comes to reduction in all sectors.
Thank you. Umberto, let me come to you to get your reaction to that. And also Urs Plush has said here on our chat that many large-scale afforestation projects have failed in the past decades because of a lack of maintenance or property rights. And how do we consider the lessons learned from the past? Perhaps you could include that as well.
Okay, I actually want to react to some of the topics raised so far. The first one is, if we are to preserve climate and biodiversity, namely getting to a reduction of 55%, one thing we do need, which is reductions all over the board. That's why we have this package, the Fit for 55, very ambitious on several grounds, including on increased carbon sinks, land-based carbon sinks. That's where the LULUCF regulation comes in, already referred. That's where the nature restoration law in preparation comes in, and there are other initiatives in preparation, like a carbon farming initiative that is also synergetic in this context. What I want to refer, in any case, it's not one single of these pieces that will be the solution. The nature restoration law will be a very important part of it for sure, and we do aim to target the ecosystems, forests and beyond, wetlands is another example, which are carbon rich. In any case, we do want restoration targets that are measurable. It's useless to have a wide target with a nice figure if in the end we cannot measure it in the ground, know what is the baseline and know where we are getting. This would be my first comment. The second comment is on land, on protected areas, the 30% target. Of course, we expect all member states to do their share and to have increased protected areas on sea and on land. But of course, we cannot expect the same level of protection of each kind of ecosystem everywhere in each member state, because there are biogeographical differences among the member states. So some will have more forests, others will have more wetlands, others may have more marine ecosystems, but we can have more diversity and more carbon sinks all over the board. On the lessons from Basel, one is very clear. We cannot do all these initiatives from tree planting to land conservation to fostering carbon sinks without proper involvement of all stakeholders, and to begin with the landowners. So this is certainly not about doing restoration or tree planting against the will or against the rights of landowners. So incentives, funding, and proper support will be crucial in all these aspects, and we will be coming with appropriate guidelines on several of these issues.
Thank you, Umberto. Now, I'm conscious of time because we have so much to get through and there's so many questions coming in that I'm going to group a few together for Helene and Sven that are perhaps more scientific than policy related. A very early question, Paul Tenning asked, is there a plant that is more effective than others to capture CO2? We also have Maya Barczak saying that there was a role of fungi in carbon sequestration. Perhaps, Helene, you could talk to me a little bit about which sort of species we're talking about here.
Well, I'm not going to be really able to answer with you and telling you oak is the solution or spruce is, because it really depends where. For those of you who are in Brussels, you might know that we have the big soil forest with beech tree. On the long run, they're going to disappear. It's getting too warm. So they were the optimum, they won't be. And they are working to change into 3 species. And this is very local. And in Finland or in Sweden, or it would be in the Netherlands or in Spain, this optimum tree will really depend, and it was going to be on context. So therefore, there is a need to go to the root and avoid this top-down approach and saying, this is the golden key, this is the silver bullet for tree planting. And on that, I think it's really interesting to have this multi-species approach that Sven mentioned. And also, like today is really focused on trees and forest, but forest are going way beyond the tree that they host. There is a whole ecosystem altogether behind, which is contributing to that. And forests are not the only ecosystem we have. And in it, we can have algae and so on that also will contribute to the discussion.
Thank you. Sven, another question we've got here is there a geographic preference for where trees should be planted to have the highest impact in terms of CO2 capture? And do we have the space to plant as many trees that are needed? That was a question from Martin Berens. And then there was also other comments that perhaps there was arguments for tree planting on agricultural land in copses where grazing animals may actually help the reforestation of certain parts of agricultural land. So Sven, perhaps you could tackle those questions about where, since Helene has tackled the what.
Yeah, so very good questions. Very quickly coming back to what Umberto talked about, the involvement of landowners. For each project, we make an agreement with the landowner in which Life Terra provides the trees and the planting capacity, sometimes even the protectors. And in exchange, the landowner commits to maintenance and not cutting that tree for at least 40 years and hopefully never. So that in that way, we hope to increase maintenance. With regard to soil and, let's say, soil biology. So obviously, if you plant a tree in Germany in a very rich former forest soil, it's way different than you try to do that in Murcia, where you have almost deserted land. So in that case, in Spain, for example, we try to add a mix of mycorrhizae and soil bacteria to regenerate and re-kickstart that soil life in order to have more chance of survival. And so coming back to the question on where do you get the most impact? Well, that's of course, we could plant all of the Nordic countries because for sure we have a high level of survival, but I think we need also a lot of trees in the south of Europe, good trees that create shadow, that can act as a barrier for erosion, that can help to restore the water table. So we have no preference. We say, if you participate in Life Terra, you participate in the European carbon mix, and one tree might grow faster in Sweden versus the one in Murcia. But in the end, it's a sort of a democratic and a joint project with a common European spirit. It's also financed by the LIFE program, and therefore we go on averages that sort of help to restore everywhere in Europe, different patches. And then the last question on agricultural land. Yes, we very much are aligned with farmers that want to transition to more sustainable agricultural practices. So for example, people that want to switch to agroforestry, we can help them with trees. And that of course has multiple benefits, as was already mentioned. And we even have planted or contributed to planting 2 small food forests. And we hope to, that's sort of a very intense way of carbon mitigation and provisioning of food and other sources. And that we hope to expand as well in the coming years. So I think it's sort of, like some of the speakers already said, it's end. Yeah, we're trying to do as much as we can in all the different places, obviously adapting to the local circumstances.
Thank you. Jutta, I think you wanted to jump in on that as well, please.
Yes, I find it very good and interesting to listen to the others when it comes to how to do it and which trees are the best and so on. And I think Life Terra seemed to be a very good project that can help out, and hopefully we can have many good examples like that. And that said, I think also we need to talk about helping the industry to develop best examples in Europe and learn from those who plant more trees. So we don't get into a system where we say that those who have the best models to replant, they should do even more, but those who doesn't do it, there we only trust in projects or support systems. I mean, we need a sustainable economic model that works in also for the future, and that is not relying on some help at this moment, but it's actually something that could be also sustainable in a decade and even longer in the future. And that is something that needs to be in cooperation with the industry. It cannot be an economic model that people who don't know how it works in reality is working in the Commission on this. That would not help to create that sustainability. One thing is that trees have a life cycle, and people who work with that, they know the life cycle in different countries, and it's very different in the Nordic countries than in the South. A tree will not grow as fast in the Nordic countries, but yet it can be very, very important to capture CO2 emissions. But then we also need to know that in the end of the life cycle, it will capture less. So it will not be better if it lives forever. But then, of course, it's the species that is important. When we have in the world 1/3 that will disappear, at this moment that there is an extension that can happen and will hurt 1/3 of every species, tree species in the world. That is a big problem for biodiversity. And maybe that's another part of this discussion where we need to have other ways of thinking, but it needs to be in connection to the debate on climate and how to create a sustainable economic model together with industry, not over the head of the industry, but in a good dialogue. I believe that's the only way. As it is today, I think the debate is a bit, here we have the industry sometimes, and here we have the political debate, and it's so divided, and it becomes more and more extreme in the two different angles, and it needs to connect better. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. One of our audience members was actually echoing those thoughts in a question, saying, Clara Ueno is saying we need a money and a business model to work with us rather than just policy incentives. Vila, let me turn that to you. I mean, how do we move this at pace if we want to achieve it? Because although there are great targets, I mean, many people would argue that we're already behind the curve.
Yes, that's the right question, and we need to create very fast incentives for landowners to start increasing their sinks and start to restore forests, and there should be a funding scheme also here involved. And I think the Commission proposes already in the LULUCF regulation the EU's carbon farming initiative is part of the approach, and we are looking at going to a certification system, and maybe in the long term, if we have ETS for emission trading, why not have something that compensates or finances sinks, kind of a sink trading scheme or something like that into long term? This is something we need to look at, but it's very important to make sure that those solutions where we push for financing for restoration and increasing of tree planting, that they are not double accounting or not offsetting or replacing emission reductions. So we need to be sure that the regulation is good in that way. But I would like to also say that from the earlier discussions, that I think it's important to realize also that tree planting is needed all around Europe. All member states need to be involved. This is also a global challenge. The local conditions vary. In some places, it's actually a big part of the climate adaptation struggle to address flooding. Forestation is a way of, keeping flooding in lower levels. So with restoring biodiversity and restoring forests, we can actually lower the risk related to climate change. And also in countries like Spain, we can address erosion and desertification. So I think it's important that tree planting takes into account the biodiversity needs and the ecosystem needs of the country where you are implementing the policies. And I think projects like Terra are looking at this, and it's important that they do it. And also agroforestry and farmers are very important to be involved here. I would just like to say that it's important that we don't just look agricultural sector separately and forest sector separately, because it's important that also agriculture addresses its emissions and increases its sinks. So we need to look at ways of also giving funding via the agricultural system to increasing also forestation and planting trees. That's a place where we already have a lot of money, but it's not directed to increasing sinks. So a lot of things can be achieved. Final comment, I would like to also say that I agree with a lot of things that Jytte is saying, but as an environmentalist and former environment minister of Finland, I have to say that this language that forest industry says that it's good for sinks to cut trees is not really true. I know that we need forest industry. I know a lot of the products that they have are needed, and especially if they bind the carbon for a longer term, then it's a sustainable product to replace fossil fuels. But we know that old forests, for example, in Nordic conditions, even dead forests, decaying dead trees, can keep the sink or the storage of the carbon for hundreds of years. With new scientific research, we've heard that the sink stays there or the storage of carbon stays there for hundreds of years. So it's important that we realize that cutting down trees is never an answer to increasing sinks. We just need to balance the use of trees and have more long-term products in forest industry, and then increasing also reforestation and afforestation.
Thank you, Ville. I want to bring Özlem, I want to bring you in now eventually. We have talked a lot about the environmental side, and we've talked a lot about policy and the nitty-gritty of replanting or upgrading existing forests. But I want to talk to you about the social dimension, because this has been, I think, one of the themes that has come through, that this is not an either or. This has got to be tackled in a holistic way. So can you give me your thoughts on the policies and regulations that would help?
So for European trade union movement, reforestation should remain of the highest priority and should be supported and coordinated by EU programs with combined policies. Special attention should be given to maintain and improve the capacity of forests to adapt to climate change. EU policy makers should pay more attention to sustainable forest management, preserve primary forest, and invest in better forest fire prevention. Enhanced coordination backed by adequate financial resources and with a focus on training, better surveillance, and better disposability, increase of emergency is needed to fight the growing tendency of large forest fires. to develop new sustainable and multifunctional plantation forests. Economic policy measures focused on increasing the efficiency of timber supply should be complemented with well-targeted measures to preserve forests and conserve their biodiversity, landscape, and social values.
Thank you very much for your insight there. Sergi, let me come back to you because we've had some very specific questions regarding the sort of maintenance, if you like, of existing forests and how do we balance between new planting and restoration?
Thank you. I think, well, when it comes to tree planting, one key point, and maybe Sven can contribute as well. I think what I really liked about the Life Terra project that's been presented is its community-led element. So I think that's, just as a quick addition to the previous discussion, where it's one other element that would be really, really important about planting the right trees in the right places, that it is done together with the local community. It is community driven. So I think that would be crucial, and I'll let Sven maybe add a little bit later to this. On your specific question, Jennifer, I think it is important that we manage forests better, and there are good examples in a number of member states where we have closer to nature forest management, where there are benefits for both biodiversity and also for the important products that forest provides. What we need to make sure as well that we really don't focus on one-sided solutions. And I did bring the case of biofuels before. I'd like to repeat it again. I think if you're only starting from just mitigating climate and you disregard the impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems, it is a false solution, because then biodiversity suffers, the water is polluted from pesticides and fertilizers, the area around is losing all those important ecosystem services that it and benefits that it provides. So moving forward, what is really important is that we realize that our forests are in dire state. We cannot just maintain doing things the way we've been doing them. A change is needed, a transformation is needed, both in how forests are managed using closer to nature forestry approaches, but also changing some of the policy frameworks that encourage false solutions. So when the Fit for 55 package is being discussed, putting the sustainability criteria for bioenergy is absolutely crucial.
Thank you. Hélène, I wanted to talk to you again with regard to forest fires. We've had a very specific question coming in asking whether or not that should be replanted immediately, or whether the land should, with the same species, or whether it should be left to recover naturally. Just a perspective on that. It's a very specific question, but I think you might be best placed to answer it.
Well, I'm going to answer more or less the same as when of the species discussion. It really depends where, and it depends what type of fire, what's the size. If you have a massive forest fire in Portugal or in northern Sweden, well, your available species, like the tree species which are able to grow, are obviously going to be very different. And would you say that you want to change a species? It means that you need to plant it. And if you need to plant, you need to have the money. And that's why it goes back to a funding question. And this Life Terra initiative is quite interesting in the sense that it provides with the financial means for the planting. But this is also something to reflect upon. So it's really going to depend what type of forest was there. Will the tree species be meaningful to stay? Because did they burn for a specific reason? What is the context? What is also, just if you think of it, the ownership size. If you take Portugal, there's a lot of private owner, but a lot of very small scale forest owner. And forest fire, they don't care about boundaries that humans have put. So it will just come and wipe out. And so if you say, okay, we are going to replant, it really depends for every of this person, of this family, what they want to do, what they can financially do, what is relevant for that. So it's, again, like an in-between scenario. I would be for definitely like going ahead, but it really depends of what do you want to do and what is a meaningful species to be put there. Is it adapted? How will it go on the long run with this climate change perspective? And also something which hasn't been mentioned so far so much, I think it's also, okay, what we plant, is it suitable? Is it locally adapted? Will it grow well? But do we want to produce something with it? And it's also something to take into account because not all tree species are equal when it comes to their potential use. So it's also like if you want a specific type of timber because you want to build more in wood-based material, you need specific type of species. So this also has to be reflected in taking the big picture regarding to that question.
Thank you. And I think you're feeding back into some of those ideas we discussed earlier about the need for an economic model as well to drive change. Humberto, I want to come back to you. I think you wanted to comment on forest fires, and I've also got a couple of follow-up questions for you as well.
Yeah, let me. I do want to tackle forest fires. I happen to be Portuguese. I've seen the devastating fires of 2017, and this summer elsewhere in Europe, I've seen the same things happening. So that does involve some reflection on related with trees. First, let me say there's of course a difference between tree planting and restoration. Tree planting can help restoration, but much of the tree planting we need, as others have said, is in urban context, in agroforestry. And I just remind the potential in agroforestry is immense, including for productive purposes. So I do hope the member states in their CAP strategic plans do tackle agroforestry properly. Now, on trees, as Hélène said, not all trees are equal in terms of their productivity, but they are also not all equal in terms of the way they react to forest fires. We don't have unburnable trees for sure, but we do have some tree populations and some tree species that have evolved to resist fire. It happens, for instance, cork, I used to say, is a product of evolution to resist fire from the cork oak tree. So I don't mean we need cork oak trees everywhere, but often after a fire, we do need to restore something different than before, which may imply tree planting, may also imply just removing the exotic invasive land species prevailing after the fire and allowing the natural regeneration to come. But it also involves restoring a viable ecosystem, including in its faunal element. We know more and more that large herbivores can help through their own activity on preventing forest fires. And all this restoration, I can assure you, is not only much cheaper than forest fire fighting, it's also the only approach when the mega fires come. We cannot tackle them through suppression. We need to tackle them through prevention, and that means a proper ecosystem management.
Thank you. I see a lot of nodding heads there as well. Susanna Callio is asking actually Humberto about how this sort of thing will be quantified. She says the Commission announced planting of additional trees. Will restoration action of existing forests with tree planting be accounted for that in addition or as part of it?
Well, let me first explain where the 3 billion trees comes, this pledge to plant 3 billion trees, is we had estimates that indicated that within a decade we could expect normally 3 billion trees to come in, and we want 3 billion additional trees to come in. So this is different from the nature restoration law. In the nature restoration law, still in preparation, we intend to come with proposed targets per specific ecosystems, notably the carbon rich, as I said, including forests, for member states to develop their own national plans of restoration and come up with the proper restoration. tree planting can be linked with the restoration or not. It just depends. It depends on the ecosystem. It depends if the natural regeneration does the job for you, which is less expensive. In some cases, it may require some active planting. But as I said, these 3 billion trees, as Life Terra is also doing, do aim very much to be planted on the places where the win-wins are the most. A good example being urban context.
And Umberto, before I let you off the hook, I have another question for you. This one from Angela Esteban, who is asking, is it likely in the near future that the carbon removal certificate mechanism will be part of the EU emissions trading scheme so that industrial sectors will promote forest restoration activities? She's saying that this would be a good way to achieve the 2030 targets. What is your assessment of the likelihood of that?
Well, I can give you just a personal assessment. I don't have direct responsibility on that, but as Vila also referred, that's an avenue that's being looked into, having ways to make the effective removal by trees count also in terms of certificates. So I cannot say when or if, but as an interested citizen, if you want, I wouldn't be surprised that within some time, something like that could emerge for proper compensation of preserving the forests.
Thank you very much. We have a good question now from Anne-Sophie Henningsen from Forests of the World, who is asking, how do we avoid that forests and tree planting just become an excuse for inaction in other sectors? It's provocative and quite a good question, so I think probably directed at most of the panelists. But Jutta, let me put it to you.
Yeah, I think this question is really important because we have, on one side, it is extremely important that we change the deforestation that we see in the world, but also in Europe, and that we can get a bigger carbon sink for 2030 than the trends are now, because we are actually moving in the wrong direction. So this is extremely important, and I endorse the European Commission's proposal on the 3 billion trees that will be planted extra. I think this is really something historical and important. On the other hand, I think maybe not with intention, but in the debate, I think some rely on the carbon sink as an excuse not to do more with reduction. And that's exactly your question. And I would say what we can do is that all the institutions negotiating the climate package, the Fit for 55 or 57, that I would like to say, because that's actually the promise from the Commission that we would go even further. I think in the negotiation here, we need to understand that the climate law is the absolute minimum. We need to actually do more. We need to make sure that the sectorial legislation is having a better targets, and that they are over exceeding the target for their own part, so that we actually accomplish more to 2030. And I think the IPCC report that we have this summer, which showed alarmingly new results where we are going, where the planet is going if we don't turn this and do more. And the 10-year we have ahead of us is actually extremely important, because in this report they say we will not be able to fulfill the Paris Agreement, and the 1.5 we will actually go over in 13 years if we don't change dramatically. So I think the answer to your question is that we need to do more in the sectorial legislation with the reduction targets, and that's the only way.
Thank you. Sergi, I would like to come back to you to ask quite a broad question. Jerry Lawson has asked, what should be in the carbon farming initiative when it's announced by DG Climate in November? What would you like to see, or have you any aspirations from what you would like to see in the coming months?
Yeah, speaking, wearing my EEB hat on, we do welcome the development of the carbon initiative. I think it's very, very important that agricultural sector, it also very much in light with what Jutta was just saying, that different sectors and different sectoral regulation really pushes the ambitious target achievement. And we believe the target is insufficient. It needs to be even much beyond what's currently being agreed if we are to achieve Paris Agreement and really heed the warnings that science is telling us. So I think it's important that agricultural sector is fully contributing and reducing and is helping also to mitigate. So we actually would like to see good elements in the initiative, including certification that really provide the right incentives and the right rules for the agricultural sector to really fully contribute to mitigation efforts as part of this cross-sectoral approach.
Thank you. Sven, I'm going to come to you. A quick question just in from Ragnar Johnson is saying that even disregarding the need for a transition to a bioeconomy, if forests are left unmanaged, at some points they turn from a carbon sink into a carbon source. Management of forests going forward is obviously got to be on the agenda as well as just planting. How do you marry the two together? How do you get that management level in from the very beginning?
That's again an interesting question. Probably more relevant for Helene in this case, because she's actually working on behalf of the owners. We collaborate with the owners, so it is really up to them really to see what they do with it. Of course, we work with forest owners, with farmers, with city councils, or with provincial authorities that want to restore pieces of nature. We always have said that in the future, should we make a profit in the foundation, at least 10% of that will be reserved for future maintenance and particularly forest fire prevention. So as you might know, particularly in the southern European countries, I think 90% of the fires, they start in the first 100 meters of people throwing a cigarette or somebody doing a barbecue or, in summertime. So it's very important to keep that first 50, 100 meters clean and take out the combustible. So I think that in the long term, properly managed those zones around forests can have an important effect on preventing forest fires. I wanted to come back very shortly to a comment that Sergi made earlier on community and the importance of community and citizens participating. And I think that's vital. I've been planting trees for 12, 13 years here in Spain. And every time that we involve people and they become enthusiastic about it, and now thanks to the app, I'm just showing you here, I hope you can see that well. When you see that the trees that you have planted, even though they're not yours physically, I mean, you have planted them, you've contributed to it, you create a sense of co-ownership and that you contributed to something worthwhile. And that, I think, will help on the one hand, people joining and rejoining and becoming more aware of the issues. On the other hand, it also builds some pressure on the landowner to really maintain those trees and ensure that it becomes a success, because these people might come back and will also be monitoring those plantings. So that's important. Then something Helen said very interesting on the economic benefits for landowners in the long run, and particularly long-term resiliency. And I think it's therefore interesting to mention a project that we did, what we call a Klimawald, so our first climate forest that we did in Germany, 25 hectares, to test species that are in principle much more resilient to climate change, species that thrive in certain conditions with much less rain, but can withstand cold winters. And we're doing that to test how these trees are performing. And I think we are looking at Life Terra to, I mean, you saw all our goals, but we're also looking at how can we increase the effectiveness and the long-term performance of these trees in 20, 30, 50 years. So therefore, I think it's good that we test these species that come from more southern provenance and see if they make both ecological and economic sense for the landowners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sven. We will get the details of where people can find that app in the chat before we wrap up in 10 minutes, so people can click on that straight away. So keep an eye on the chat if you're following along online. I think at this point, since we do just have 10 minutes left, we're going to go for some quite quick round of thoughts to close. So I would like just a couple of words from each of you. How confident are you that the EU will achieve its target to cut carbon emissions by at least 55% by 2030? And what role, medium, large, small, will tree planting and reforestation play in that? Umberto, no doubt you are very confident.
I am very confident on two grounds. And the first ground is the package of initiatives, legal initiatives, not only, that were presented, which make the EU the most advanced bloc in the world in terms of climate policy. And I think that is very reassuring, also the political support that it has obtained so far and will continue to obtain. But my main reason for confidence is, in a nutshell, public opinion. When I've seen, and we see continuously, the climate impacts coming to Europe, floods, forest fires, elsewhere than Europe, a bit everywhere, we are seeing live now, directly every day, the consequences of climate change, and further than climate change, the consequences of mismanagement of nature and biodiversity, because the floods don't come only from climate change, they are exacerbated on bad conditions that pre-exist, as do forest fires. And this has an emotional impact in people that make most of public opinion require action. And that's the best assurance for politics to move and keep moving. So in a nutshell, I think we do have the Green Deal. We will certainly have a follow-up of the Green Deal, which will not be less ambitious.
Thank you. Özlem, I cannot see you there, sorry, so I'm going to go straight to Jutta. How confident are you in the EU's ability to achieve its targets in time?
I am confident that we will deliver on the climate law, but I want us to do more. And I think IPCC report this summer showed that there is a necessity to do more to 2030. So I would like the sectorial legislation to actually have a better, what do you say in English? Work better. This is not the word I was looking for. The sectorial legislation needs to be even better than the climate law, and that's the big thing. I think that there cannot be a watering out every time we negotiate. It needs to, this time we need to make sure that we have the best ambition will also survive the negotiations. And that is what I would like to say. But I also like to conclude by saying that I really think that we should also use the best techniques and the best models, sustainable models in our different member states to do what we can do to have a better carbon sink, and the forest plays an enormous important role there. But we need to know what we are doing on the ground, and we need to know, as many have pointed out in this debate, that it's different in different countries, in different climate zones in Europe, and therefore we need to work differently. And above all, we need to have a model that will survive the future. So it needs to be in cooperation also with the industry. And I think the best way is actually to take the best parts from the Commission of Ambition and then the best techniques from the industry and make sure we work together for the future, then it will be sustainable.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jutta. Ville, your final question, same thing to you. How confident are you in our ability to achieve the targets set?
On that, I'm rather confident, and I have to also applaud the Commission. I've been doing environmental politics for 20 years, and this is the first Commission and the first ambition from any government or an international body at this level in addressing climate change and biodiversity at the same time. So that we realize that sustainable economy in the long term is only possible by protecting the existing nature, restoring nature, and valuing nature, and increasing the sinks, and addressing climate change in a way where we also see the value of the ecosystems close to us. And here, I think it's important that in all sectorial legislation that we do, like Jutta said, that we take into account the whole picture. And I think we are closer to that we have been in the past 20 years. I mean, we've had tries at doing this, reversing the loss of biodiversity, reversing climate emissions. But now, for the first time, we realize that we need to build a sustainable economy as a whole, not just, with one hand protect and the other hand continue business as usual. And I think this is a big business case. So we need to really involve also the sectors that are on the economic side of this, the landowners, that in the long term, this is something that will also protect their livelihood, their future income, if we do this sustainably. So I am positive that we will achieve the targets we have set. Whether that's still enough to protect biodiversity and address climate change, maybe we need to add up on that, but at least we are on the right path, maybe for the first time in the last decades.
Thank you. And Sergi, to you now, and your final thoughts, focusing on what you think is achievable by 2030.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jennifer. I do want to be confident because we need, failure is really not an option. We are talking about this, our survival. So I really think it's important. And there are, as other previous speakers mentioned, there are some new elements there. The science is very, very clear. We know how dire the situation is and what we need to do. We have the support of the citizens. We have amazing youths that really care about their future and are really pushing very strongly for political will. We have some political will, at least on the rhetoric level, that is sort of pushing towards the Green Deal objectives and really longer term future also for those economic sectors, because they don't have the future if the ecosystem and the nature system collapses and the climate system collapses. So I think the realization of this longer term is still there. So there are some elements that do make me confident that we know it's possible, we know it needs to be done. However, we do know that old habits die very, very hard. We have seen that with the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, where all these elements were there as well, and nevertheless, it was really the short-term interests of the vested interests that really prevailed, and the policy is very much remaining the same, not Green Deal compliant. So I think what is really, really important is that we recognize those positive elements that are going for Fit for 55 and the need to achieve the mitigation objectives and biodiversity objectives through restoration and tree planting in the right places with the right tree species. There are things going for that, and we really need sort of all hands on deck to really make that happen across the stakeholders, with the incentives, with the proper policy framework. Because as I said, we really have 10 years and failure is not an option.
Thank you. Hélène, your final thoughts briefly. Sergi says it can't just be business as usual. What do you think?
Well, I would say that ambition, as great as it is not sufficient. We need to see how it's happened in real life and in reality, and how the support, which everybody has been talking about, is going to happen. The CAP, for example, was mentioned several times. At the moment, I hear that the CAP is going to solve many, many problems, and we all know that the financial cake got smaller, but we are more and more people around it. So this is not going to be sufficient. Other options will have to be considered. Humberto mentioned that there is a foreseen financial benefit that will come around restoration and so on, but will this come up to the owner? If you have a really nice tourism that is going on, maybe as the owner of the forest, you're not going to be the one benefiting out of it. So it's something that I'd like to keep in mind and bear in mind. And with regard to the upcoming 10 years and really focusing on the contribution of tree, I'd like to stress that 10 years in the life of a tree, that's nothing. We're speaking in a very different time scale. And that's why it's really important to keep in mind that mitigation is not going to be done solely based on sustainable forest management. Reducing fossil emission is essential across sector, and obviously the forest sector will contribute, will also provide an alternative and to this fossil fuel material, but to keep in mind. And at the end of the day, as mentioned in the intro statement, a success story is only going to be happening with motivated and committed owner, the one that you have been respecting and involving from the very first day that you considered their land for your project.
Thank you, Elaine. And Sven, since we unfortunately lost Özlem due to technical problems, the final word goes to you. So you've got 1 minute before we're due to wrap up for your closing thoughts.
I want to echo the words of Sergi that failure is not an option, and I'm an optimistic guy by nature, so that helps. And we're going to do and try our best to get to those 500 million, but I also very much agree with Helene again on the need to involve landowners and reward them for their ecosystem services that they're providing, not only the wood, but so many other things related to that. So if Europe can come around to that and say, let's not leave that to the member states, but make a framework to reward them, I see it clear in together with reduction, on the other hand, a lot of creating a lot of carbon sinks and green infrastructure. We are now available in or active in 8 countries. We're going to add Czech Republic and Malta this year. If you're around this coming planting season and you'd like to join, please check liveterra.eu for the upcoming agenda, and you're more than welcome to join us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sven, and indeed thank you to Live Terra for helping to support today's debate. Panelists, you were excellent. You've learned a lot. I've learned a lot, rather, during this last hour and a half, and I think our audience has as well, judging by some of the great comments and questions we've had coming in. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to tackle all of those questions. When do we ever? Time is always short. And indeed, in tackling climate change, time is equally short. So please do continue the conversation online. Share the videos with your friends, share the videos with your colleagues, and do keep following EA Debates for more Euractiv updates on this and other important topics. And have a great day.
Live Terra is co-financed by the European Commission through the LIFE programme.